All 18th century women do is wear a face patch and lie. Hey! Welcome to another fashion history video essay written, starring, edited, produced, and catered by me, Alicia. So this time we're looking at the use of face patches in 18th century Britain and France, and specifically considering the communicative function of fashion as well as the interplay of class, gender, and identity. Real quick, I do just want to say thank you so much to everyone who watched my first fashion history video essay, my first YouTube video ever. I posted it 2 weeks ago and I think it's sitting at almost 30,000 views, which well exceeded my expectations, and it means a lot, so thank you. So while the use of face patches in the 18th century ladies' toilette has received due consideration, we're going to analyze how the accessory was actually used to convey political and social identity. We're also going to look at the varying criticism the accessory prompted based on the wearer themselves. For elite women, patches weren't just a fashionable statement. They could actually be used as markers of, again, disposition or even political affiliation. This use of fashion as a form of expression unsettled some, you guessed it, contemporary men, highlighting the resistance to women's growing role in the political sphere. Meanwhile, for lower class women, patches took on an entirely different significance. Rather than statements of identity, they were associated with venereal disease and moral corruption. Both wealthy and poor women faced scrutiny for wearing patches, but the reasoning behind the criticism they faced could not have been more different. So I'll provide a very brief history of face patches just for contextual purposes, but if you would like to skip that section, no offense taken, just go to the indicated timestamp. I will also link a few videos that go a little more in depth into the history of face patches, and as always, we'll have my own bibliography linked, just in case you want to explore the subject further, but I am shamelessly requesting that you finish this video before doing any of that. Okay, thanks! So face patches have been used since ancient times for the purpose of covering blemishes, such as battle scars. Oh, it just started snowing so aggressively and one of my lights just went out. Oh, she's back on. I don't know what's happening. For the purpose of concealing blemishes or marks left by disease, such as smallpox, Kimberly Crispin Campbell has noted the evolution from the practical to the aesthetic use of face patches, starting at the end of the 16th century as France was sort of emerging as the new epicenter of fashion. Patches were typically made from expensive materials like black velvet or silk, and they were pasted onto the face using a resin-based adhesive or just saliva, also known as mouche. La mouche means fly in French, in case you were wondering. Or plaisters. Patches could be used to offset a pale complexion, to emulate the beauty mark of the Roman goddess Venus perhaps, or to highlight certain facial features. Gaining popularity into the 17th century, patches could come in a variety of shapes, such as hearts, circles, diamonds, stars, and crescent moons. Sorry, Starface, but 1600s babes were doing it first. Despite growing popularity amongst fashionable French women and men, beauty patches were not immune to the haters. Excessive use could convey desperation, while the absence of patches could render one's look chuggy. The heightened artifice of patches in France drew criticism, particularly from cultural critics in more conservative societies like Britain. With the rise of the Puritan movement, Oliver Cromwell is said to have opposed patches, deeming them elitist.
Lucy's all made up!
With makeup?
Yes.
God!
In 1649, coinciding with the execution of Charles I, a bill advocating for the ban of face patches, entitled "The Vice of Painting and Wearing Black Patches in Immodest Dresses," was presented to Parliament. However, the bill's impracticality prevented its passage.
Frivolous events distract us Puritans from our devotion to Christ.
Still, the accessory became the frequent subject of criticism and satire. In the Convict Guide, The Gentleman's Companion or a Guide to the Female Sex from 1673, the author Hannah Woolley, and I say that with air quotes because it wasn't the real Hannah Woolley, who was a author with a number of successful publishings on domestic management. No, this was an imposter essentially trying to steal market shares away from the actual best-selling author. Anyway, this fake Hannah Woolley gave a disparaging take on British women's cosmetics, mainly face patches.
But whilst I seem to give you young gentlewomen some allowances of liberty in your clothing,
For indeed it is impossible there should be youth without some vanity, yet I know not how to excuse the vain custom now so much in fashion, to deform the face with black patches, under a pretense to make it appear more beautiful. It is a riddle to me that a blemish should appear a grace, a deformity be esteemed a beauty. I am confident were any of them born with those half moons, stars, coach and horses, and such like trumpery. I cannot imagine whence our ladies borrowed that monstrous and prodigious custom of patching their faces. If they did borrow it from the French, they did ill to imitate such, who it may be use of the fashion of pure necessity and not novelty. Having French pimples, they needed a French plaister, who could so cunningly turn botches into beauty and make ugliness handsome.
Yeah, no, I'm not breaking out. This is a French pimple. It's called fashion. You wouldn't understand. An entry from the diary of famous British diarist Samuel Pepys. Yes, that is actually how you say his name. From the 22nd of November, 1660 reads,
The Princess Henrietta is very pretty, but much below my expectation, and her dressing of herself with her hair frizzed short up to her ears did make her seem so much the less to me, but my wife standing near her with 2 or 3 black patches on and well dressed did seem to me much handsomer than she.
I mean, good for your wife and all, but like, we don't have to bring down other women. Although I do kind of get what he means by the hair, because every time I see a portrait of Henrietta, she's very much giving me Cavalier King Charles Spaniel vibes.
When I say I got that dog in me, this is what I mean.
Another from the 5th of May, 1668 reads,
One thing of familiarity I observed in my Lee Castlemaine, she called to one of her women another that sat by this for a little patch off her face, and put it into her mouth and wetted it, and so clapped it upon her own by the side of her mouth. I suppose she is feeling a pimple rising there.
Actually, it's a French pimple. It's called fashion. You wouldn't get it.
Must you write everything down, Pepys?
By the 18th century, the more communicative function of patches was becoming more realized. The number and placement of patches could reflect one's social status, political affiliation, and even became a visual language of coquetry. Women's magazines advise on where to patch to communicate one's disposition. Here are some diagrams showing examples of placements. They varied based on the publication, but for example, sticking one on the chin could indicate playfulness. The cheek was flirty, the nose was cheeky. If you were in love, you might place a patch near your eye. If you were proud, stick a patch right on your forehead. And for the most dollette, Lana Ray, will you serve me lemonade with a side pickle and a little pink bow on top, coquette girlies, the lip. In Facing Beauty, Painted Women, and Cosmetic Art, Eileen Ribeiro notes that these magazines of the time also offered advice on how not to patch, suggesting that respectable women should never wear more than 2 and never near the mouth. Sorry, coquette girlies. The 18th century satirization and criticism of patches was still mostly targeted at women. Henri M. Misson's 1719 memoirs and observations in his travels over England observed the use of patches is not unknown to the French ladies, but she that wear them must be young and handsome. In England, old, young, handsome, ugly, all are bepatched until bedrid. I've often counted 15 patches or more upon the swarthy, wrinkled face of an old hag. Okay, rude. Obviously, that is an exaggeration, but notice how, much to Henri's dismay, in Britain, unlike in France, patching has become ubiquitous amongst a wider feminine demographic. His insinuation that patches should be reserved for young, beautiful, wealthy women is a sentiment echoed throughout the century. For instance, the 1750 satire Pride mocks the futile attempts of an aging woman to preserve her youth by adopting the trend, covering imperfections with numerous patches. The artist ridicules this woman's efforts as patches represent vanity and feebly trying to maintain a youthful appearance and also spending extensive time at the toilette. These themes are addressed by various satirists, including Jonathan Swift, who we will be talking about later. For instance, his The Ladies' Dressing Room, which one of my literature professors affectionately referred to as Celia Schitz. If you know, you know. As aforementioned, the practical use of patches predates their aesthetic purpose, and they could be used to cover blemishes left over by common diseases such as smallpox or more taboo ailments of the venereal genre. Naturally, women with afflicted complexions might use more face patches to cover such marks, and unfortunately this led to heightened ostracization. Okay, that's enough background context. The tradition of employing fashion as a political device is well understood, and examples run rampant throughout the 18th century. As Elaine Challis argues, the politics in 18th century England had specific dimensions for the elite, which expanded to include social politics. She explains that women played a vital part in creating and sustaining a uniquely politicized society and the political elite itself. Fashion was deeply embedded in the political rituals of these women. This display was particularly evident during elections, when women ornamented their dress often in party colors and themselves with ribbons, bandeaux, and other political symbols. These political expressions of fashion obviously did not go without criticism. Yes, from opposing parties naturally, but also from, you guessed it, contemporary men. In their scrutiny, they tried to dissuade women from making such fashionable declarations and indeed to reconsider their involvement in the political sphere altogether.
They said no girls allowed, actually.
And this theme certainly extended to that of patches. On Sunday, March 8, my birthday, 1711, Jonathan Swift wrote essay number 31 for the Examiner and discussed the ways in which women attending the playhouse were distinguishing their political affiliation through fashion. Before going forward, I have to mention the political significance of this opera setting. A year before, in February 1710, the disconnect between the Whigs and the Tories, fueled by the decision of the Whig government to put Tory clergyman Henry Sacheverell on trial, led to Queen Anne's departure from her Whig ministries and towards the Tory cause. During these tumultuous times, playhouses became of a certain value, especially to the Whigs, whose ideological issues such as patriotism, populism, and politeness were played out in conflict over opera seria. The political fashion, Swift observed, included marks of party in their muffs, their fans, and in their furbelows. Amongst these examples, Swift had some rather interesting things to say about our accessory in question as well. He claimed that the ladies of the Whig Party put on their patches in a different manner from that of the Tories, causing even more drama at the opera. Theater kids, am I right? He even said that if a man switched his political party, he could count on the loss of his mistress. Swift criticizes these women for causing divisions, and though it is probably exaggerated, it is compelling for two reasons. The first being the transgression of function from Patch's superficial origins discussed earlier.
In case you skipped it.
The other being that this deliberate translation from fashion to politics suggests an effective presentation. This was not an isolated incident either. That same spring, Swift's acquaintance and fellow essayist Joseph Addison would write for The Spectator, a paper with an opposing political perspective to Swift's Tory position. I should note that Swift was becoming increasingly outspoken for the Tory cause, and he even wrote to his wife Stella saying that his relationship with Addison had been waning due to the political differences between the two, which had diminished the friendly meetings between them. They were beefing, basically. Addison had recently started The Spectator, and he was contrastingly attached to the Whig cause. As such, the criticism these women faced for their partisan patching was not merely party motivated. Wow. Okay. In essay number 81, Addison records a similar observation and argues that the junction of fashion and politics would not only create divisions, but would go so far as to threaten traditional feminine virtues. All 18th century women do is wear face patch and lie. So Addison is also at the opera, which again was a fittingly politically charged environment. He notices that women's faces are patched differently, as party signals to distinguish friends from foes. The Whigs on the right, the Tories on the left, and some women in the center who had not yet marked their political affiliation with a patch. He claims those apolitical women over time decreased until only those identifying as either Whigs or Tories remain. Addison indicates a mischievous back and forth. He alleges that the Tory patches were once observed to be 20 more than that of the Whigs, only to be challenged the next morning with the whole puppet show filled with the faces spotted after the Whiggish manner. Addison then claims that the political devotion of these so-called few fantastical coquettes was merely motivated by their desire to attract a man. He says some would go so far as to switch the side of their patch to align with the values of a love interest. All 18th century women do is wear face patch and lie. However, like Swift, he ensured that there are several women of honor who patch out of principle and with an eye to the interests of their country, claiming that there are ladies so steadfast that they patch on the side of their choice despite the opinion of some guy. He credits one famous Whig partisan whom he calls Rosalinda, who was born with a natural mole on the Tory side of her face, which, being very conspicuous, has occasioned many mistakes and given a handle to her enemies to misrepresent her face as though it had revolted from the Whig interest. He closes with an attempt to dissuade women from intertwining fashion and politics altogether, appealing to British ladies via Greek and Roman mythology, whereby women acted as peacemakers for opposing parties. As our English women excel those of all nations in beauty, they should endeavor to distinguish themselves as tender mothers and faithful wives rather than as furious partisans. Female virtues are of a domestic turn. Would our English ladies, instead of sticking on a patch against those of her own country, shew themselves so truly public-spirited as to sacrifice every one on her necklace against the common enemy? What decrees ought not be made in favor of them? He found this issue of partisan patching apparently prevalent and disturbing enough to try and entice participating ladies back to their perceived rightful domestic positions. Of course, there are degrees of satire and hyperbole in both of these essays. Addison himself recognized that his account would appear improbable to those who live at a distance from the fashionable world. However, the existence of political patch battles or of a woman called Rosalinda with such a Tory mole is not essential. Despite their political opposition, Addison and Swift observed what Karina Navikas identifies as radical women's use of symbolism to justify their unprecedented involvement in political affairs. These were explicit efforts to discredit female attempts to dabble in politics through fashion. The way I see it, the political use of the accessory was significant enough for political newspapers, ones with opposing views at that, to supplement their critiques of women in politics by including these anecdotes, fabricated or not. The tendency to make fashionable political displays by the Whig Party has also received due recognition, and Henderson acknowledges that in such interconnected societies, women could and often did influence political decisions, especially for the Whigs. One fascinating participant of the Whig cause and a fashion icon in her own right, Grace Dalrymple Elliott, exemplifies this narrative.
Dalrymple. How do you say that?
Dalrymple.
Dalrymple. Dalrymple. Dalrymple.
Grace was a Scottish-born society lady, courtesan, and even served as a spy resident during the French Revolution. She was renowned for her beauty and style and made displays of her attachment to the Whig cause throughout the 1780s in particular. Also, this specific portrait of her is at the Met, and I may or may not have teared up when I first saw it in person. Grace developed a relationship with Colonel Charles Fitzpatrick. Richard Fitzpatrick. Who is Charles? Oh, he's a guy. Oh, Charles James Fox. I know Charles. Grace developed a relationship with Colonel Richard Fitzpatrick, who was a friend and fellow politician to Charles James Fox. This secured her a spot by his side, campaigning for the Whigs on the streets of Westminster, much like Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. Grace, like many of Fox's supporters, sported the buff and blue colors of the Whig Party, and many British papers took to reporting on her fashions. According to the April 22nd, 1784 issue of the Gazetteer and New Daily Advertiser, Miss Dalrymple is so azurized that nothing under the blue sky can exceed her. She wears a blue hat, her eyes are blue, her breast bows and ribbons are the same color, her carriage is also blue, and she is called, by way of distinction, the Blue Belle of Scotland. Clearly no stranger to the power of political fashion, Grace was dressing herself in blue to proclaim to the world her support for both her lover and his politics, and an educated and clever woman in her own right would actively take part in the political world she inhabited. Establishing Grace's character and her tendency to make sartorial political displays warrants the inspection of potential messages in other fashionable choices she made, like wearing a face patch. For instance, Thomas Gainsborough's 1782 portrait of Grace reveals a deliberate placement of a Whig face patch. Grace, who was pregnant at the time, is depicted from the waist up and stares outwardly towards the viewer, a feature that the Public Advertiser found disturbing, commenting that her eyes appeared too characteristic of her vocation. God forbid women have hobbies. Grace is well made up in the typical style of the 18th century, adorned with powdered hair, rouge, painted lips, and most notably a face patch which she dons on her right cheek. Not only would this place the patch on the wig or the right side, but also that cheek placement of the patch could indicate the gallantry of the wearer. As previously discussed, Elaine Challis explains that the social function of fashion is imperative in analyzing women's political roles throughout the 18th century in Britain. Consider the prevalence of patches mentioned throughout various 1780s issues of the New Ladies magazine or the Polite and Entertaining Companion for the Fair Sex. Volume 2 from 1878 is of particular interest because it gives specific instructions for ladies on how and where to place patches to convey different meanings, advising these 9 ways to patch. Number 1, the passionate or smart patch at the corner of the eye. 2, the majestic, almost in the middle of the forehead. 3, the gay, on the brink of the dimple formed by a smile. 4, the gallant, in the middle of the cheek. 5, the kissing at the corner of the mouth. 6, the brisk near the nose. 7, the coquettish upon the lips. 8, the discreet or prudish under the lower lip towards the chin. And 9, the concealing upon a pimple, a French pimple. This guide confirms the existence of intentional social patching in Britain that has been well acknowledged in France, with borrowed names like passionate and gallant, the latter possibly adopted by Grace Elliott. To reiterate Hannah Gregg, who I just realized is right here with us, Fashion and Faction, the Politics of Court Dress in 18th Century England, rightly notes that not every woman could have been attached to the political implications of her chosen style. Of course, women could wear face patches as merely a fashionable accessory and without conveying any political or social messages, but Grace was not just any woman. In the 1782 portrait, the intimacy of her close position to the viewer, as well as the details of her face, and the knowledge of her growing fashionable and political influence in the 1780s allow for the viewer to ponder the patch in a more meaningful way. In Grace Dalrymple Elliott, Joanne Major and Sarah Murden point out that Grace would have put some thought into how she wished to be presented in this portrait and what messages she wished to send through it. In this case, a gallant woman in support of the Whig cause. Despite criticisms these women may have faced, I love the idea of using patches as kind of a form of agency in the 18th century. However, for those less fortunate in society, there were much darker implications. The same magazines take on a cautionary tone when advising ladies to not improperly patch. This emphasizes anxieties not surrounding the act of patching itself, but for the potential of the accessory to communicate unwanted messages. Those who deviated from the set rules of patching were warned that they may be perceived in a promiscuous manner and may bring ill consequences such as ruining a fair character as well as lead the enamourate to many a mistake. Of course, the wearer could not always decide the placement or number of the patches. N.F. Lowe discusses their more medicinal function, wherein some instances were not patches at all. Treatment for venereal sores were often mercury-based, and they could be mixed with turpentine into a mortar until a black powder was obtained, and when applied to the sore it could resemble a beauty spot. The idea that a patch could suggest either gallantry or promiscuity based on the wearer is exemplified in William Hogarth's satirical work, specifically his 1732 engravings of a Harlot's Progress and his 1732 to 1734 paintings of a Rake's Progress. My camera died. In A Harlot's Progress, a beautiful young mall hackabout is enticed into prostitution for financial instability reasons. A brothel keeper whose visage is covered in face patches conveys impurity, as in this context they are understood to cover scarring left over from venereal disease rather than indicating the socio-political identities of the upper echelons. As the story progresses, the young woman's face becomes plastered with more and more face patches until she dies of venereal disease at age 23. A Rake's Progress tells the story of a young man named Tom Rakewell who makes some poor choices while irresponsibly spending his inheritance. He descends into madness and becomes incarcerated at what is essentially an insane asylum. This painting, entitled, can I say that on here? This orgy depicts that underway at a brothel. The face patches depicted on these women are meant to look a lot differently than those who are advocating for their political party or trying to appear fun and flirty to a suitor. There's this implication that women who patched may have had something to hide. This could be merely a superficial imperfection or clues to sexually transmitted diseases. Hogarth isn't criticizing patching itself, but more the ways in which patches could communicate certain traits of certain women wearing them, that is, sexual immorality and deceit. For the women portrayed in Hogarth's works, patches act as an integral part of their ensemble and are symbolic of their societal downfalls. It's important to note that both elite women and women outcasted from society were criticized for wearing patches, but for totally different reasons. For wealthy women, including courtesans, patches could not only act as a fashion-forward cosmetic choice, but as a bold declaration of character and political allegiance. This anxiety that stirred amongst influential men, so vividly portrayed through print culture, speaks to the performative potential of fashion in this era. On the other end of the spectrum, the so-called fallen woman faced a different type of scrutiny. For lower-class women and prostitutes alike, patches were entangled with notions of corruption and impurity. Despite sharing the same accessory, the instructions for wealthy women to avoid any implied similitude underscore the class-based nuances of societal expectations in fashion. With their widespread use and appeal spanning various demographics, the beauty patch and its varied meanings is demonstrative that even the smallest fragments of fashion can reflect the larger presentation of cultural and societal complexities. Y'all, I'm so mad at myself because I just remembered I had this whole like Rococo inspired look I was gonna do. Instead, I'm dressed like a 1971 Sears catalog girl, so I fell off clearly. I've been really loving getting to delve more into YouTube. This again is something I've wanted to do for a really long time. If you liked this video essay, I would really appreciate if you liked and subscribed and maybe left a respectful comment. And also feel free to recommend any other topics you might want to see. I'm going to start covering not only fashion history and vintage styling, but also film and commentary and just general things that I find interesting. So feel free to recommend whatever, honestly. Something might stick. Okay, well, thank you again for watching. Thank you so much for 100,000 subscribers, and I will see you in the next one. Okay, bye!